I'm extremely honored to be here today and to share some of my research with you as part of the York Circle Lecture Series, which I've just discovered exists, and it's pretty amazing. So thank you all for coming out. I would especially like to thank Dean Barbara Crow for the initial invitation, and Dagmar Hinders and Nicole Light for their coordination efforts. And of course, as I mentioned, I'm really grateful to you for taking time out of your weekends instead of doing grocery shopping or laundry or watching sports or whatever. It was a Grey Cup weekend. I really appreciate you coming here today. My talk is part of a larger project funded by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And that project is entitled Ambassadors of Empire, Child Performers and Anglo-American Audiences. And this is a website in development connected to that project. This project seeks to trace the movement of child performers across transatlantic circuits in the early to mid-19th century and asks how and to what extent these child performers affirmed Anglo-American cultural values, served imperial interests, and provoked debate about colonial as well as national identity. And so rather than seeing performing children as passive vessels or victims of exploitation, which of course is not to deny that a number of these children were, of course, pushed into showbiz by their parents or managers, et cetera. So the issue of exploitation is certainly one that's important. But I really want to emphasize how they contributed to the development of a transatlantic performance culture in the early to mid-19th century and assess the various ways that they supported or facilitated the expansion of imperialist projects. And in particular, I'm looking at sort of British and American imperialist projects. So as you've probably guessed, this project is very much about looking at borders and boundaries and boundary crossing. As a representative sampling of the larger project, today I'm going to look at this theme of performance across boundaries in 4 ways. And so I'll outline those 4 ways and then sort of dig a little bit further into them as we go along. So first, I'm interested in the boundary between child performers and their audiences and the way that objects, particularly objects produced to commemorate or celebrate these performers, mediated this relationship by extending the experience of the theatrical event into the home and in some cases onto the bodies of audience members. And in my research, I've been struck by the number and variety of objects that circulated along or beside child performers. These include figurines, fans, medals, paper dolls, sketches, carriages, cups, tables, ink pots. I mean, it's kind of an endless list of objects that circulate these performers. And I want to suggest that rather than treating these objects as incidental to the popularity of child performers, I want to suggest that a close analysis of the production, consumption, and distribution of these objects, as well as really close attention to the content of the objects and the way that they're made, their formation, can offer valuable insight into audience-performer relations and the emergence of what we now recognize as celebrity culture. And although historians do debate the terms, the relevance of terms like celebrity or celebrity culture when we're talking about the 19th century, some suggest that celebrity culture is really the product of late capitalism. It's a 20th century phenomenon, et cetera, so we shouldn't be using it to talk about the 19th century. I tend to agree with the historian Simon Morgan, who argues that celebrity should be understood, quote, less as a somewhat arbitrary status assigned to this or that individual, and more as a cultural and economic formation which plays a wider role in society as a whole, end quote. So according to Morgan, individuals become celebrities in the moment when, as he writes, a sufficiently large audience is interested in their actions, image, and personality to create a viable market for commodities carrying their likeness and for information about their lives and views. So if we accept Morgan's definition of celebrity, and so for the purposes of today, I hope you will accept it, then it becomes clear that such a market existed in the early 19th century, if not much earlier, and that this market can be traced through the objects that now reside in archives and also continue to circulate online. I don't know if many of you have gone onto eBay to look for kind of objects from the 19th century or before, but it is an incredibly rich archive for collectors, both amateur collectors and professional collectors alike. And as I hope to demonstrate today, 19th century audiences throughout Britain and North America were obsessed with child performers, not just their onstage performances, but their offstage lives as well. and eagerly purchased all manner of commodities bearing their likenesses in an effort to get close to them in some way. Second, connected to the theme of boundaries, I'm interested in how certain objects blur the boundary between human and non-human, subjectivity and objectivity, by directing or scripting certain kinds of interactions with both other objects and other humans. And in this perspective, I'm really inspired by a recent turn within theater and performance studies and the humanities more generally. This turn has been referred to as new materialist turn or post-humanist turn. And that's really an interesting a project that's looking at how objects interact with humans. And scholars who are part of this turn reject the basic tenets of humanism, which privileges humans over all other entities, non-human or more than human entities, nature, etc., and instead insist on the vital materiality and agency of the non-human world. Objects are not just passive, they can act too and act upon us. So for example, thing theorist Bill Brown points to the moment when otherwise everyday objects sort of leap up into the frame of vision and take on a much more active force in our lives. He writes, "We begin to confront the thingness of objects when they quit working for us. When the drill breaks, when the car stalls, when the window gets filthy, when their flow within the circuits of production, consumption, and exhibition has been arrested, however momentarily." And in other words, so when objects that are, we kind of take for granted in our everyday lives get in our way or do something to us. So for example, you're slicing carrots for dinner, the knife slips and slices your finger. You become suddenly aware of how these objects, which are now elevated to a thing status, inform our sense of self and identity. And in fact, in some cases, if you cut your finger, you're doing all kinds of actions. So you could suggest that this object has become this thing that's directing how you move and act. And so in such moments, the dynamic relationship between humans and non-humans becomes blindingly apparent. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the musical Sweeney Todd. This is Johnny Depp as Sweeney Todd. But in that musical, there's a song that he sings a love song to his razor blade and the sense that he is whole as a human once he's come into contact with this object. So I think this is a really interesting example to suggest how important objects are to our sense of self. And all of the objects that I consider today can be viewed as things in that they arrested me in some way. They kind of captured or caught me when I was looking at them and prompted me, and hopefully you as well, to ask different questions about human-object relations. Third, I'm interested in how child performers moved across boundaries of age and gender through performance, and how this movement is represented or not in the objects created to celebrate and commemorate them. As historians of childhood have shown, the 19th century marked a dramatic shift in the conception of childhood, from notions of the child as a small adult who was born corrupted and needed to be carefully educated because they were full of original sin and needed to be treated in a really strict way with swift punishment in order to steer them onto the correct path. So that was an older view. And then it began to shift towards a view of seeing children as the epitome of innocence, as these blessed angels who required tender love and protection. So it's quite a shift that's happening in the 19th century. And child performers presented unique opportunities to observe idealized children in many guises. And in fact, one of the most attractive qualities I want to suggest of certain child performers, including those we'll be looking at today, is the way that they effortlessly portrayed much older characters. And in the case of girl performers, the way that they effortlessly portrayed male characters as well. So there's this really interesting way that these children are exploring all kinds of boundaries. And the objects that were created to commemorate their virtuosic performances also played with these ideas of age and gender, inviting audiences to rethink rigid identity categories. Fourth, and finally, although I can really only sort of touch on this today, but it's certainly something that's important for the larger project, I'm interested in the geographical circulation of child performers across borders and boundaries of nation, and the way that objects facilitated and marked this circulation by introducing audiences to them, often before children had visited a certain, in some cases, a certain colony or a certain town, and sort of were helping to do important work on behalf of the performer. And the market for images and other representations grew rapidly in the 19th century, and it extended far beyond Great Britain and far beyond North America into the colonies and elsewhere. And through such objects, audiences could realize their desires to interact with these celebrated stars who they saw as cute and virtuosic. And they could align themselves with audiences elsewhere. And so this is important sort of imaginative work that these children facilitate. They help to bind audiences in geographically disparate areas to one another and allow them to feel that they're part of a much larger community. So the development of celebrity culture was tied up with this much larger project of empire building, and I argue that child performers and the objects that bore their images were really critical players in both projects. So to further explore this performance across boundaries, what I want to do today is offer two mini case studies of celebrated child stars by analyzing an object or group of objects that carry their images. So I'm going to begin with a boy who is arguably the first child celebrity ever, or at least the first child celebrity of the 19th century. And then I'll talk about a girl performer who is really interesting, I think, for some other reasons as well. Master Betty. Master William Henry West Betty is arguably the first child celebrity of the modern era. Throughout his relatively short career, at least in comparison with other performers of the era, he drew huge crowds to the theaters where he was playing in Scotland, Ireland, and England. And he sparked, like many of the performers I'm looking at, the circulation of numerous commodities. He also provided ample critical fodder for all kinds of journalists and critics, not to mention gossip for everybody. And pamphleteers, caricaturists, and poets all tried to align themselves with him in order to advance their own careers. So he's a really important figure. Born in September 1791 in Shrewsbury, Master Betty first attracted notice in the summer of 1804 at the age of 12 for his portrayal of, as one supporter wrote, the higher and more difficult characters in the tragic walk, in a style seldom or rarely exhibited by the most celebrated theatrical veteran. After appearances in Belfast, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Liverpool, where audiences greeted him with explosive rounds of applause, if you believe all the, the writing. And sometimes you have to be really careful as a historian. You're like, oh, everybody loved him. Actually, wait a minute. How many people did love him? But certainly the account suggests that audiences were really delighted with what they saw. And they declared that he was a young Roscius. And this, of course, was a reference to Roscius, the great actor of the Roman era. And this term was applied rather loosely to a lot of other actors. There was a Scottish Roscius, an Irish Roscius, a big Roscius, little Roscius, but he was the celebrated young Roscius. And based on this growing fame, he traveled with his parents to London for scheduled performances at both licensed theatre houses, Covent Garden and Drury Lane. And in the lead up to his London debut, several authors released pamphlets accounting for his career to date, his extensive career at the age of 12, and sang his praises through description and poetry. So some of these, this is like a caricature kind of talking about his when he was in London. This is an example of some poetry that was written, in some cases to celebrate, and in other cases to parody public obsession with Master Betty. And in fact, between 1804 and 1805, Betty was the subject of at least 20 pamphlets, not to mention numerous other newspaper articles and reviews. So this is kind of like Justin Bieber fever, like when that was really happening, where everybody was like, oh my God, Justin Bieber. It's Betty mania, which is kind of like, Bieber fever. Some authors who fashioned themselves like bard-like figures gave tributes, wrote poems and called them such things as the Bettyad. Here's the Bettyad here, the infant Roscius, and the young Rosciad. And these publications allowed audiences who'd only heard of the child to become acquainted with him and others' perceptions of him before they saw him in person. So this is really helping to pave the way for audiences to receive Master Betty when he finally arrives in town. Now, not surprisingly, some Londoners questioned whether, he was all that everybody was saying he was, especially since, what people think in Liverpool, that's fine, but really, do they have the taste that we Londoners have? And so there were all sorts of questions about, can we judge what the people, really think of him? But others were saying, well, let's just wait and find out. So on December 3rd, 1804, Master Betty made his debut at Covent Garden in the role of Achmet or Selim in the play Barbarossa, John Brown's tragedy about the Algerian ruler. And a huge crowd gathered outside the theater before the doors opened, waiting impatiently for admittance to the house. And the situation went from bad to worse, as this caricature called Vain Attempts to See the Young Roscius suggests, as well as some journalistic accounts. So I'm just going to read from two accounts. It was in vain that at a very early hour yesterday evening, we took our station at the door in order to procure admission. But so intense and so violent was the crowd of persons assembled with the same intention that it was impossible to pass very far beyond the entrance, nor could we perceive by any advance or diminution of numbers that the inner doors were ever opened for admission. In this state, the heat and pressure after a time became so intolerable that a variety of persons fainted, and others were in danger of suffocation and other injuries from the weight and force of the numbers from without, who could not be prevailed upon by the representations or the shrieks of the people confined within to desist from attempting to force their passage. The danger at last becoming extreme, the guards were ultimately called upon by the terrified persons who were included between the inner and outer doors and who could not make good their retreat. So this is simply that it gives you a sense of just how excited audiences were to see Betty. They want to be there. They want to be at the front of the theater, and there's such a huge crush of bodies going in. And this crush continued inside the theater as well. This is another journalist's account. At 5, the outer doors of the box passage were forced open, and the boxes were occupied by an immense crowd, who forcibly ejected the persons stationed to keep places. The numbers still poured in with such rapidity and pressure that some hundreds leapt from the boxes into the pit. So the boxes around the theater into the pit on the ground, which was so crowded by this accession that numbers must have perished, but for the humane attentions of some ladies in the boxes who assisted in raising and passing them to the lobbies. So you have this image of these ladies in their, their fine evening wear, helping these other people, these men who've leapt down from the boxes into the pit, who are about to pass out, and they're like dragging them forcibly out to save them. The number outside the house and in the passage still continued to increase, though every effort was made to assure them that their exertions must be unavailing. We have not heard of any fatal accident, but the fainting, bruises, and minor contingencies are beyond all enumeration. So you really get a sense of just the crush and how excited people were to see Betty, as well as some inclination that audiences of the past maybe have not changed so much from audiences of the present. When we think about in certain sporting incidents and other incidents where people are so Black Friday shopping incidents, right, where people are so desperate to get into a space that they stop caring about the bodies beside them. So that was the kind of hysteria that surrounded Master Betty. Now, I don't have time to detail the many critical responses that followed Betty's first performances. Suffice to say that the critics generally thought that he did pretty well at his debut. They noted his technical skill, his expressive capabilities, and his convincing portrayal of strong emotion. There was a lot about his emotion. And eager to see the child wonder for themselves, crowds who hadn't been there for the first night came to subsequent performances, and he offered other roles as well. These roles included young Norval in Douglas, Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, Frederick in Lover's Vows, and of course, Hamlet, because what child performer doesn't want to perform Hamlet? The diversity of which really served as a testament to his uncanny talent. So this is a period where there's all kinds of repertoire, where actors are called upon to perform a wide variety of roles, and this is part of the charm of Master Betty, was look at all of the roles that he can so easily master. It's really impressive. And Betty was an attraction outside the theater as well. According to one account, quote, "The attraction of the young Roscius is not limited to the stage, for he cannot walk along the streets without drawing crowds, who naturally press after him to see the most extraordinary pickpocket that the theater ever knew." So this writer is somewhat skeptical, I think, of Betty. He suggests that he's just a pickpocket, but certainly audiences, were really excited to see him. And we definitely get a sense of, celebrity culture as we know it today, when celebrities are out in public and people sort of swarm around them. So people were swarming around Betty. And this intense interest in Betty intensified when he became ill and had to withdraw from the stage for several days. And people were waiting outside his house, pressing their noses against the windows, waiting for updates. Is he okay? And the doctor had to release some information saying, yes, today I bled him, and he vomited. And like, it was the amount of detail about his physical health was a little extreme. But we can see how all of this behavior anticipates what would become, by the mid-century, a full-fledged cult of the child, where children are sort of upheld in this wonderful way. This is another image. Sort of some of the division, two managers competing for Betty because he's so desirable, and he's weighing the manager's gold. So while pamphleteers and caricaturists were among the first to capitalize on Betty's rapidly growing popularity, other industrious artists and craftspeople likewise seized the opportunity to celebrate the young Rossius. And in keeping with the dominant interest in what the scholar Asa Briggs describes as a culture of commemoration, wherein the British population celebrated all manner of battles, coronations, births, lectures, celebrities, etc., the market was soon flooded with medals, fans, paper dolls, cups, and snuff boxes, all bearing Master Betty's image. Some commemorative commodities, like these paper dolls here, which are now housed in the Folger Shakespeare Library, invited Betty fans, presumably children, but perhaps not necessarily, to put themselves simultaneously into the role of the young actor as well as his characters. And so we have a really interesting kind of nesting effect happening here where somebody, okay, I'm going to be Betty, but I'm going to be Betty as Romeo or Betty as Hamlet. It encourages all kinds of interesting play, both with age, gender, and the variety of roles that Betty's playing. Other commodities, I don't have an image of this, but I've come across references to the Rossius dance fan, and similar fans that were inscribed with the child's image were marketed at women, and they encouraged them to perform their femininity through the mediation of the young boy. And so you can imagine, this is sort of from 1804, around the same period of Betty's popularity, you can imagine women taking their Betty fan to the ball and waving his image as they're dancing with a man. So it kind of creates a really fascinating dynamic between between the woman, her fan, and whatever man she's dancing with. Complicated. Well, other objects like, oops, I'm going to come back to that. I don't have an image there. I'll see it in a minute. Well, snuff boxes attracted male consumers and scripted a more personal, even intimate encounter with the actor or his image. And I'm going to talk more about snuff boxes in a minute. But first, I want to talk briefly about the relationship between these small, cute objects, which were created to celebrate Betty, and the cuteness of Betty himself. As both Laurie Marish and Sean Nye have shown, historically, children have been aligned with commodities through their performance of cuteness, while small or miniaturized commodities have in turn been aligned with children through their projection of vulnerability and fragility. As Marish writes, the cute always, in some sense, designates a commodity in search of its mother and is constructed to generate material desire. The consumer, or potential consumer of the cute, is expected to pretend she or he is the cute's mother. And we can think of the kind of reactions that are elicited by images like this, or this, right? We respond to these displays, and they talk about the kinds of verbal responses. Oh, right? We almost start to talk like babies ourselves. Oh my God, when we see really cute things. And of course, the cute sells, clearly cute sells. And we can see how the cute operates through dolls, stuffed animals, and other objects that are typically associated with children, which aestheticize a kind of powerlessness. So it's powerlessness in the form of a stuffed animal. And we buy that because it's cute, and we're drawn to it because we want to care for it. And as Marish puts it, what the cute stages is in part a need for adult care. So as one of the first child celebrities, and this is an image of Betty as performing with an adult on stage, and so you get definitely a sense of not only the size differences, but how he's very much being presented as a child, even if he's supposed to be playing an adult role. So as one of the first child celebrities, Betty circulated within an emergent commodity, emergent economy of cuteness, where he was valued for his size, charm, and vulnerability, and the need for adult care, and that became very apparent when he was ill. And we can see this in the urgent desire on the part of some pamphleteers to defend Betty against the attacks that others launched against him. But the cute commodities, some cute commodities, I think, challenge the way that Marlis talks about cuteness. She tends to associate it with women. She suggests that it's sort of a development that happens in the mid-19th century. And I want to suggest that by looking at snuff boxes, we in fact get a sense of a different connection, both that this cuteness, this economy of cuteness is happening much earlier, and that what Marlis describes as an erotics of maternal longing is not necessarily maternal, that in fact there's a more complicated dynamic happening through other objects. So some snuff boxes. Snuff boxes, in case you're not aware, were popular collectible items among the social elite, as well as members of the emergent middle class throughout most of the 18th and much of the early 19th century. Both Lord Byron and Beau Brummel were known for their extensive snuff box collections, and the Earl of Harrington was rumored to have enough snuff boxes for every day of the year, including ones for morning, noon, and night. So really, quite a collector. Snuff, if you're wondering, is ground up and distilled tobacco, often scented with jasmine, rose, bergamot, lemon, or other strong scents, and it's inhaled through the nostrils. And throughout the 18th and early 19th century, snuff takers carried their snuff around with them through all parts of public life in snuff boxes. And they would remove a pinch at a time, sometimes as frequently as 10 minutes if they were really addicted. The morning talk about vices. Snuff taking was definitely a vice of this era. People would be inhaling it often as frequently as every 10 minutes. One observer in the early 18th century talked about going to a coffee house where he observed a fluttering assembly of snuffing peripatetics, and he noted that the clashing of their snuff box lids in opening and shutting made more noise than their tongues. So this is sort of part of public life. It's a very, for the most part, male activity, a homosocial activity, something that men do when they get together. It's an important part of demonstrating your gentlemanly status. So snuff's enduring popularity encouraged the expansion of a market for lavish snuff boxes, including those ornamented with miniature portraits, which are painted onto vellum and then ivory with watercolors. And subjects include, famous individuals, your loved ones, your pets. You can get all kinds of really interesting things on snuff boxes. And the Folger Shakespeare Library has a collection of Master Betty snuff boxes, which include an array of his portraits. And they suggest, at least I'm suggesting, that they offer evidence of the size of his male audience base, that he really must have appealed to men given the number of these snuff boxes in existence. And of course, women did use snuff. Some women used snuff, but it was predominantly a male kind of practice. So here are some from the Folger. These snuff boxes vary in size and design. Some show Master Betty's face in profile, like the one at the top there, highlighting his attractive facial features and curly mane of hair. Interestingly, it's really difficult to see here, but there's sort of an attractive sort of lace collar that he has in the image on the right, which kind of leads down to what would be a woman's décolletage. So it's kind of interesting to think about the costuming there, as though he's sort of being feminized. Some snuff boxes, like this one here, show Betty in character, and there's a clear connection between what appears on the snuff box and then a print of Betty that's in circulation, suggests that the artist likely drew on the print to create the image. And here the emphasis is less on the physical characters, his physical features, than on his skill as an actor, his command of the stage. This pair of finely detailed snuff boxes show Betty in the role of Douglas, a warrior, and Romeo, a lover. And the similarity in their design suggests, I think, that they're perhaps part of a set that may have included even other snuff boxes, perhaps showing Betty in other roles, and that whoever created these was hoping to kind of play into desire on the part of collectors to collect them all, right? Much like hockey cards or baseball cards. We want to collect the full set. But these boxes suggest something else beyond just sort of this interest in Betty and this desire to collect. I want to suggest that the snuff boxes, in their size, in their design, and their function, invited collectors to feel an intimate, embodied connection to the actor. And size is an important factor in this. As small, transportable objects, snuff boxes were typically, as one writer observed, carried in the left-hand waistcoat pocket from which it was withdrawn. Let me see if I can do this. I'll use this with the right hand and then pass to the left. Right? So you'd have it in your pocket. You take it out, put it in your right hand, and then take your snuff out. So you can, and then you would ingest the snuff, and there's usually sort of a sense of contentment in inhaling. And so you can imagine the kind of erotic associations that this act of snuff taking may have drawn, and that users may have drawn between the experience of looking at the cover, seeing, oh, look, isn't he so cute, taking out the snuff, and then feeling that sense of release that comes with the taking snuff. So, and I'm not suggesting here that taking snuff and that these snuff boxes were encouraging same-sex desire, or that this was an overtly sexual connection that audiences were experiencing with Betty, but that certainly there is something quite erotic, quite sensual that's happening through these objects, and these objects are mediating that kind of connection. And this reading, I think, is further supported by accounts of the number of men who attended Master Betty's performances. The earlier account of the men sort of jumping from the boxes into the pit, passing out and having to be pulled out of to the boxes to safety. And so I see a curious analog between this desire to be physically close to Betty, to inhale the same air as him, right at the front of the stage, inhaling the same air, and the act of taking snuff, which is also an act of ingestion or inhalation. The latter, of course, was much safer, at least in the interim. So by purchasing a snuff box or a series of snuff boxes, I want to suggest that audiences found a way to be close to Betty, to consume him, and to align themselves physically and experience this very intimate, embodied relationship with him. And you may disagree entirely. So that's another portrait of Betty there. So I want to shift now and talk about another very popular child performer of the early 19th century, and that is a child performer named Jean Margaret Davenport. Now, Master Betty's popularity was relatively short-lived in comparison to the decades-long popularity of such celebrated actors as David Garrick, Sarah Siddons, or Edmund Kean, but he nevertheless whetted the public's appetite for child stars. And you see, after Betty's success, just a huge number of other children who tried to outdo him, or at least their parents tried to outdo his parents' success in coming to the stage. And one of the first major transatlantic child stars of the 19th century was Jean Margaret Davenport. And so I look at how her image circulated in the form of a Staffordshire figurine. But first, a little bit about her. Born in 1828, Jean Margaret Davenport made her stage debut in 1835 at the age of 7, so earlier than Master Betty made his debut, in the Richmond, Surrey Theatre, where the famous romantic actor Edmund Kean had once played. And Kean was known for his emotional sort of outbursts, for his extreme variations in his character. He was very romantic in that respect. Big R, capital R, romantic. And so with her parents' support and ministrations, Jean Margaret quickly mastered a broad repertoire that included Richard III, Shylock, Rob Roy, as well as Lady Teazle and Juliet. So she kind of had a huge repertoire. And her father, who was a former lawyer, managed and acted alongside his daughter. And he developed a suite of publicity tactics to promote her. He frequently billed her as an astonishing juvenile actress, as the first juvenile actress of the day. And while she fiercely denied the association later in life, she's widely rumored to have been the inspiration for Charles Dickens' Ninetta Crummles, the falsely advertised infant phenomenon in Nicholas Nickleby. So if you're familiar with Nicholas Nickleby and the Crummles characters, they're incredibly despicable characters. Ninetta Crummles is passed off as this infant phenomenon, but is a much older girl who has been given alcohol and sort of try to keep her young, but she's just not talented at all. And Jean Davenport was kind of dogged by these rumors throughout her entire life. Much later in life, she wrote a letter saying, "I am not Ninetta Crummles." She's like, "Not me." Now, after success in England, including a debut at Drury Lane, Jean Davenport and her family embarked on several tours of the provinces and colonies. They visited North America in the fall of 1838. They performed in Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Montreal, and then they took a later tour in 1840, 1841, where they visited the Caribbean and the Maritimes, and they even made it to Newfoundland. She apparently was the first professional actress to perform in Newfoundland. So she's really interesting for a number of reasons. And like other child actresses of the period, she demonstrated her emotional vulnerability in tragic male roles, but also showcased her flexibility and range in flashy afterpieces like The Manager's Daughter, which her father had written especially for her, where she had a chance to play 6 different roles in the span of about 10 minutes. So it's just about constant variety, constant flexibility and range. And reviews of her performances suggest that part of her appeal may have been the novelty of seeing a child playing such characters as Shylock or Richard III, but that also that she had a really uncanny ability to move audiences emotionally. One writer wrote, this is a writer from Kingston, Jamaica, that her portrayal of Shylock, when he finds himself thwarted in his revenge, was, quote, nothing could excel the haggard look, the horror-stricken mind depicted by Miss Davenport in the scene. And another thought that, with the exception of Edmund Kean, her Shylock, quote, far surpassed those who have made it the study of their lives to excel in this great creation of the poet. So basically, she's better than the, like the adult males. And so they really were quite astonished with her ability. And we see this kind of example of boundary crossing as part of that appeal between age and gender. And accounts of the Davenport family indicate that Thomas Davenport was quite the publicity wonder, and he molded his daughter's career not only through carefully worded advertisements and newspaper stories, but also through publicity stunts. And one former company member reported that whenever they tour the provinces, they'd arrive in town and then, quote, Thomas Davenport would select a lodging which all the churchgoers would have to pass by on Sunday morning. He would dress up the infant phenomenon, Jean Margaret, and make her sit dancing a big doll where she could be seen in the window. There's a doll. And the people would stand in groups, open-mouthed in wonder, at the baby who played with her doll in the morning and trod the boards at night as Macbeth. And so this account suggests that much of the pleasure of watching a child actress like Jean Davenport came from observing these huge disparities of gender, age, nationality between the performer and her role. So girl, child by day, murderous king by night, Jean Davenport delighted audiences with her prodigious abilities. And as this strategic deployment of the big doll, and dolls are in fact really important, in The Manager's Daughter, she also bounds on stage with a doll. So dolls are a really important part of the way that Thomas Davenport was promoting his daughter. But he also took pains to emphasize the relationship between her and the other objects that encircled her. These included the lavish or sentimental gifts that she received from her admirers, which included a gold watch and chain, as well as a hat that apparently Edmund Kean had bestowed upon her, this great actor giving her his hat. And so we see again this equation of cuteness with commodities and children, which had the effect of foregrounding her desirability without making that desirability sexual. And as Laurie Marish writes, cuteness performs the desexualization of the child's body, redefining that body from an object of lust, either sexual or economic, to an object of disinterested affection. Cuteness is thus a realm of erotic regulation, the containment of child sexuality, and protection from violence and exploitation. End quote. So in other words, objects were key to safely promoting Jean Davenport as an infant phenomenon, who, among other things, convincingly portrayed male sexual desire in roles like Richard III, where she played the love scene with her mother in the role of Lady Anne. It just gets even weirder. Anyway, this cuteness is also evident in Jean Davenport's representation in a Staffordshire figurine. I'm going to talk a little bit about Staffordshire figurines in general before showing you the one of her. Now, throughout the 19th century, Staffordshire was a major center of pottery production, with plates, bowls, cups, and figurines all being produced there. Glazed pottery figures dated back to the 18th century, but became increasingly popular and accessible in the 19th century thanks to innovations in glazing and the introduction of new paint colors. So these objects became sort of much more within the reach of middle-class collectors. And these figurines offered a veritable who's who of Victorian celebrity culture. They included criminals, politicians, singers, dancers, royalty. There are many, if you go on eBay, many Queen Victoria figurines. And they demonstrate the popularity of souvenirs and other objects of commemoration. In creating these figures, Staffordshire potters often drew on engravings, sheet music, photographs, printing, other illustrated newspapers, and other prints to make really lifelike versions, lifelike figurines. And so there's a really direct correspondence between the explosion of print culture in the 19th century and the kind of growth of this industry for creating these celebrity figurines. We can see a really good example here of the actor William Charles Macready as Richard III, and then this is the figurine that I saw at the Houghton Library, where very clearly you can see just in the pose, in the costuming, that this the potter has drawn quite liberally from the image. So this Staffordshire figurine represents Margaret Davenport in the role of young Norval in the play Douglas, which is a Highland tragedy. And so it's Jean Davenport as a male character in this play. And it now resides in the collections of the Houghton Library at Harvard. The historian Robert Simpson McLean has argued that this figure was likely based on an engraving. And this is on the right is the engraving of Jean Margaret. And he suggests that this print is one that her father probably sold to audiences. So audiences would have seen the print, and then, there's no evidence that her father also sold the figurines. People maybe going to a potter would have recognized, oh, that's Jean Davenport, from having seen her print. And so this really important symbiotic relationship between all of these other these artists. And it's impossible to know who purchased this figurine, or whether they did so because they liked Jean Davenport, or they just liked, they were Scottish and they liked the figurine. But we can speculate that whoever bought it would likely have placed it in a place of pride in their home, perhaps on a parlor mantelpiece or a drawing room bookshelf. And the Victorian studies scholar Rowan McWilliam describes how Staffordshire figurines and other collectibles enlivened, in his words, the mental and emotional world of the mantelpiece, which I think is just such a wonderful descriptive phrase, making it a space for memory and pleasure. So that the mantelpiece in the home is a really important place. It's where you put your beloved objects. And so for people to put objects like Jean Davenport's figurine there suggests something about their relationship to her. And so the mantelpiece is functioning as a site of performance and commemoration and celebration for showcasing the objects that are important to you. And so if, in fact, the form of the Staffordshire figurine invites this kind of function about thinking about commemoration, unlike snuff boxes, which could be carried in a pocket, so we're very close to the body, figurines invited collectors to place them sort of at a remove from the body, at a distance, because they're breakable. They're hard, they're cold, and if you don't handle them carefully, they can be easily broken. You might, of course, take them down, occasionally to dust them or to show them to friends, but for the most part, they're going to be in a place of pride, so that you can reflect upon them, but you're not interacting with them physically. And so the vulnerability of this kind of object accounts for their preciousness as well as their cuteness. And it reminds us, as Marish and I emphasize, of the relationship between the way that the cute appeals through its vulnerability. So they're cute because they're vulnerable. We want to take care of them. And when I was at the Houghton Library at Harvard, all of the figurines I had a chance to look at were really carefully, they were wrapped in bubble wrap. I had a chance to unwrap them very, very carefully, very gingerly. And it was as though you're kind of holding a newborn. Like there's a sense of, I don't want to drop this. I don't want to destroy this incredibly precious object. And so some of this cuteness derives from this sense of responsibility, this need to care for this really sensitive, important object. All right, so So to return to this discussion of how Jean Davenport was cautiously cute, so her father was sort of suggesting that she's surrounded by cute objects. This works to desexualize her. These objects also work in the same way. They invite a similar relationship with audiences by bringing the public world of the stage into the privacy of the home. And the parlor in the Victorian era tended to function as a liminal space between public and private. So displayed on a shelf, the figurine made Jean Davenport, sorry, I'm going to come back to that in a moment, appear both simultaneously familiar, she's part of our home, we see her every day, as well as strange. We have access to her, but we really can't touch her. She's too distanced from us. And of course, this is one of the ways that modern celebrity culture works, this negotiation between access and denial, singularity and typicality. And we can think of, I don't know if you're like me, you like to look at Us Magazine from time to time. One of Us Magazine's pages is their stars, they're just like us. Pages where, stars go grocery shopping. Stars, they use baskets. And there's a sense that both the way that we can connect to celebrities and yet still be very distanced from them is part of their appeal. And performance theorist Joseph Roach, in writing about the it quality of a lot of celebrities, says that part of it is the power of the apparently effortless embodiment of contradictory qualities simultaneously: strength and vulnerability, innocence and experience, singularity and typicality among them. So the possessor of it keeps this precarious balance between these two. And so we can see in the Staffordshire figurine how Davenport's it qualities come through and is manifested through the sculpted pottery. She's both accessible and incredibly fragile. The object is an extension of her celebrity. And I think there's also something potentially subversive about this figurine as well. It's of a young girl playing an adult male character, and it's very different from other figurines of women who are often very feminine. This is another actress, I think it's in the role of Juliet. She's a boy, she's a male here, which I think is potentially subversive in her boundary crossing, and that perhaps audiences who are collecting her were kind of interested in that, and that whoever brought her into their home may have been inspired to cross boundaries themselves, or at least to test them, to explore them in some way. All right, so to conclude, I know I'm almost at my time, so I want to just conclude with a few final thoughts. As I hope I've shown today, and certainly we can talk about this, paying close attention to the material culture of child performers in the 19th century affords a unique perspective on the development and expansion of celebrity culture in this period, especially as it relates to children. Such objects not only tell us about who was popular, they also offer valuable clues about how audiences interacted with these objects and how, in turn, such interactions may have fostered deep emotional connections. Now, of course, it's impossible to know with any certainty that the objects had such an effect on their collectors, but looking at objects as more than mere representations of child performers opens up a much richer, more dynamic view of 19th century celebrity culture and the role of the boundary crossing child within it. Thank you.